coming along, I'll go ahead and just let you know that you are in the right place. This is the webinar from Springfield Community Gardens and Extension on GAP certification. And in case you don't know me, my name is Anna Withers. I'm the Farmer and Resource Development Manager for Springfield Community Gardens. And we are a nonprofit in Springfield, Missouri, whose mission is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. As of right now, we're operating 17 community gardens, 3 urban farms, a commercial test kitchen, and a community food forest right here in the Ozarks. Happy to offer those. And this workshop on preparing for a GAP safety audit is funded by the Missouri Department of Agriculture's Specialty Crop Block Program. So thank you very much to the USDA and Missouri Department of Agriculture. And once again, we're very lucky to be joined by Patrick Byers. He's the horticulture field specialist and food safety specialist with the University of Missouri Extension Office. And he'll get us started in just a minute. But before we do, just make sure we're happy to answer your questions as we go along throughout the night. So just notice there's a Q&A button as well as a chat button at the bottom of the screen. Please direct questions to the Q&A and I'll chat comments to the chat box. And that way it helps me keep track and make sure that we've answered everything that we need to get to. And then after you leave the workshop, a screen will pop up with a link to a quick post-workshop survey. Please, if you don't mind, take just 2 minutes to fill that out. It's very valuable in our reporting to the USDA, and it also helps us provide meaningful workshops to you and feedback to our presenters in the future. So very much appreciated if you take a moment to do that. And then I will put different links into the chat here in just a minute, but I'll make sure to put in our website, all of our social media channels, a link to our YouTube agricultural workshop playlist. And that is a very good playlist. We have mounted an extensive library of different topics, ranging from everything to elderberry production, to beekeeping, to building your own cooling containers, many produce food safety aspects that we've covered from harvest to post-harvest handling. So take a look in there. I know that there are valuable topics for everyone, or if you ever have trouble, feel free to reach me directly. And then I'll also put a link to Patrick's evaluation in there for whenever we conclude. But I think that's all from me. So thank you again for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Patrick.
Very good. Thank you, Anna. Well, I am Patrick Byers with University of Missouri Extension, and I am a horticulture field specialist, which means I work with specialty crops, fruits, vegetables, cut flowers, ornamental plants, and the people who are growing these crops. And in fact, the goal of my program is to help farmers be profitable in the short term and sustainable in the long term. In addition to working with horticulture, I've also worked extensively in produce food safety. So it's a really nice intersection of, first of all, growing these crops, but also growing them in a safe way so that the people, the consumers who enjoy what we grow, don't have problems with those crops. And tonight we're going to cover a topic called a third-party audit. And we'll define that term here in a moment, but just to set the stage, oftentimes when farmers are producing crops, of course, obviously their goal is to produce crops in a safe way. But frequently, a particular market, being at a farmer's market, being at a grocery store, a school, an institution, that market wants evidence that farmers understand how to grow and handle crops safely. And that's where third-party audits come in. And so that's what we'll be talking about tonight. As Anna mentioned, this is meant to be a very informal presentation. I probably about, maybe 45 to 50 minutes of prepared comments, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. I may even pause periodically during the presentation to address any questions that are placed in the Q&A. And at the end of the time, the end of the prepared remarks, then we'll have time to unmute and ask questions orally. So look forward to spending the next hour or so with you on the topic of third-party food safety audits. Okay, Anna, can you please give me a check to let me know if the presentation has come up?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, very good. Let me go ahead and clear some of this floating meeting control stuff out of the way. Okay, so again, this is the topic of what we're going to cover tonight, preparing for a third-party produce food safety audit. This is a very introductory presentation. If anyone among the attendees tonight is interested in a third-party audit and you'd like to visit with me individually, I would welcome that. My contact information will be on the last slide, and you can always reach me through my collaboration with Springfield Community Gardens or through my office with the Webster County Extension Office in Marshfield. So here's an outline of what we're going to do. First of all, we'll talk about third-party audits and what they are. And we'll talk about the relationship between a third-party audit and something else called the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. These are two different things, and there's frequently confusion between these two programs, and we'll attempt to define each and eliminate any confusion. And then we'll do a deep dive into the USDA Good Agricultural Practices, or GAPS, audit program. We'll talk about what that program is. We'll talk about how to prepare for that program, and then we'll spend some time with the evaluation metric that a GAPS inspector would use during the audit, so that if you're interested in this program, you'll understand exactly what's expected of you as a farmer, and you'll be prepared so that you can pass the audit without difficulty. I'll have a few comments on other USDA audits. We'll talk about the GAPS Harmonized audit, the GAPS Harmonized Plus audit, and some comments on the Group GAPS program. Again, these are just brief comments, and if you're seriously considering one of these three audits, please reach out and we can discuss these in much more detail than we have time for tonight. And then we'll finish with some comments as to whether or not an audit is actually in your future. So what is a third-party audit? Well, basically, a third-party audit is a relationship, a situation where a farm or a food business hires a third party, an independent agency, or perhaps a government agency or a firm, to conduct an assessment of their food safety program. In other words, to take an in-depth look at how they grow, handle, and transport food. Always keep in mind that an audit is voluntary. An audit is initiated by the farm or the food business. Okay, it's not initiated by some regulatory agency or any other party. It's initiated by the farm or the food business. Now, that being said, even though it's voluntary on the part of the farm, it may be a requirement if that farm is interested in a particular market. In other words, it may be an audit. An audit may be required by a purchaser. And basically, the reason that it might be required by the purchaser is because the purchaser wants confirmation that the farm or the food business understands produce food safety. And again, it's an effort to confirm the quality and the safety of the product that they're buying. Now, there are many, many different types of third-party audits. The USDA Ag Marketing Service has taken a lead among federal agencies in developing third-party audits. And again, the program, the GAPS, GHPS, commonly called the GAPS program, is a good example. So is the GAPS Harmonized and GAP Harmonized Plus and the Group GAPS audit. These were all developed by the USDA. But there are also audits that have been developed by private firms, private third-party firms. And examples include Quality Fresh or Primus. Now, which particular audit you may be considering, oftentimes, again, is determined by the market. And a particular market may have a particular audit that they require their vendors or their suppliers to work with. For example, some of the large grocery store chains have particular audit systems that they work with. And in fact, some of them have their own in-house third-party audits. So you'll work with the particular audit that your market is interested in. Now, that being said, the USDA GAPS audit is widely accepted and probably the most widely known of all the third-party audits. And that's the audit that we're going to work with in our time together tonight. We're going to be focused on the USDA GAPS audit. Now, what typically happens during a third-party audit? Well, it's a a process that is pretty much uniform amongst all the different types of third-party audits. And typically, after the audit has been initiated, the auditor arrives at the farm or the food business, meets with site management, and they talk about the audit. And then there's usually two specific parts to the audit. The first is what's called the desk audit. And this is when the auditor, the third party, reviews the company's food safety documentation, their food safety plan, and their records. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is the farm and facility audit. And this is where the auditor will walk around, they'll take a look at the site. They may go into production fields, they may go into pack houses, they may go into holding facilities, coolers, anything that is related to growing and handling produce. And they observe and they take notes. First of all, again, they want to see that the business is doing what they actually said they were doing during the desk audit. In other words, when the auditor looked at their documentation and their records, those records and that documentation indicated that certain processes were in place, and the auditor wants to actually see those processes. Secondly, they're looking for problems. They're looking for situations that might violate the standards that the facility is being audited against. So again, there's positive and then there's kind of a negative aspect to it as well. And the third thing, of course, they want to do is to interview personnel that are involved in the farming operation. Certainly, they'll be talking to the designated produce food safety people, but they also want to talk to anybody who is working in growing, harvesting, and handling produce. Okay, once the desk audit and the farm and facility audit are complete, then the auditor is going to score the audit. In other words, they have metrics that they work with, and they're going to score the what they saw during the audit. And sometimes these are checklists that have numerical values. Sometimes these are pass-fail type checklists. But at any rate, the auditor will then communicate whether or not the farm or the food business had passed the audit. If they've passed the audit, there may still be some areas that have to be addressed related to deficiencies. Typically, a farm or a food business doesn't have to achieve a 100% score. Frequently, passing will be 80, 85%, 90%. And in that case, obviously, it indicates there may be some problems. And those deficiencies that have been identified oftentimes will have to be corrected. Even though the passing score is sufficient, the deficiencies may need to be corrected before a certificate is issued. And then that certificate is then communicated to the potential market. And then, of course, the relationship with the market can continue. Now, a few comments about the Food Safety Modernization Act, or abbreviated FSMA. So the Food Safety Modernization Act is a piece of federal legislation passed by Congress, and the Food Safety Modernization Act regulatory agency is the Food and Drug Administration. So it's important to recognize this is a piece of federal law. And there is a part of the Food Safety Modernization Act called the Produce Safety Rule, and that's abbreviated as the PSR. And the Produce Safety Rule is a comprehensive piece of regulation. And if a farm is subject to the Produce Safety Rule, well, it's a long story, but there are situations where there may be farms that are not subject to the Produce Safety Rule, but there are many cases where farms are subject to the Produce Safety Rule. They must follow the regulations in the Produce Safety Rule. And some of these regulations include, first of all, attending a mandatory food safety training. Secondly, the farm has to conduct required activities as directed by the Produce Safety Rule. The farm is also required to maintain pretty extensive records related to the way that they grow and handle produce. Again, this is part of the requirements of farms that are subject to the Produce Safety Rule. And then finally, farms subject to the Produce Safety Rule must submit to a produce food safety inspection by a regulatory agency. Now, this inspection is not the same thing as a third-party audit, but there are similarities. The criteria that are used by a regulator who is making a produce safety rule inspection are actually going to be quite close to the questions that are on a third-party audit. So there are similarities there, but these are definitely not the same thing. And here are some important differences. So first of all, if a farm is subject to the produce safety rule, they must submit to a produce food safety inspection. It's not a voluntary thing. They must submit to an inspection by a regulatory agency. In some states, the regulatory agency is the Food and Drug Administration. But in most states, the regulatory agency is a state agency. In Missouri, for example, the Missouri Department of Agriculture conducts the produce safety rule inspections. Okay. Now, a third-party audit, which we had defined earlier, is voluntary, okay? Yes, it may be required by a particular market, but it's always voluntary on the part of the farm. That farm can choose not to deal with that particular market and not submit to the third-party audit. Another important thing to consider in looking at the differences between a PSR inspection and a third-party audit are the consequences if problems show up. So if a farm is in the course of a produce safety rule inspection, the regulatory agency inspectors find that there's problems, particularly serious problems, they have the responsibility to take immediate actions. And these actions can be pretty significant. They can shut down the farm, there can be quarantines, recalls, all of these things. In the case of a third-party audit, if problems are revealed in the case of a third-party audit, there's typically not consequences for the farm, other than the fact that the third-party audit is not going to issue a certificate to the farm, and the farm may possibly lose a market. Now, obviously, if there are consequences that are identified during a third-party audit, the farm needs to address those consequences. But a third-party audit, as I mentioned, is not the same thing as a regulatory agency inspection. So it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, now let's shift our attention to the good agricultural practices, or the GAP audit. This is where we're going to spend a few minutes here tonight in our time together. So a GAP audit is a third-party food safety audit program developed by the USDA. Now, the branch of the USDA that focuses on these GAP audits is the Agriculture Marketing Service, and that's abbreviated AMS. Lots and lots of acronyms when you start to deal with state and federal agencies. So the Good Agricultural Practices was a very innovative program that was implemented in 2002. And again, it was a voluntary program developed by the USDA that was then offered to the fruit and vegetable industry. Again, with the goal, obviously, of verifying an operations efforts to minimize the risk of contamination of fresh fruits, vegetables, and nuts by microbial pathogens. Same goal, of course, that the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule has, but the GAPS audit program actually predates it by a number of years. So again, voluntary program developed by the USDA Ag Marketing Service to help guarantee that, or help verify that a farm's practices are in place to help minimize the risk of foodborne illness. Now, if a farm is interested in a good agricultural practices or a GAP audit, here are some things to consider. First of all, this is not an undertaking to be taken lightly. This is a process that requires adequate preparation, and it's an expensive process, as we'll see here in a moment. So again, it's very important that as a farm enters into the planning for a GAPS audit, that this be done in a very deliberate plan. First step is to participate in a training or a mentoring program that focuses on produce food safety. Now, a great place to start is the mandatory training that I mentioned earlier for farms subject to the produce safety rule. Anyone can attend these trainings. They're held at frequent intervals. Many of these trainings are now offered in a remote delivery option online. There are also in-person trainings, and this is an excellent way to get a good grounding in produce food safety. It's an 8-hour intensive class. It definitely requires a commitment of time, but it's a fabulous way to get that basic grounding in produce food safety. But of course, that's not the only option. There are other options available to develop an understanding of produce food safety. There are publications, there are online courses that are available. Many of these don't require that 8-hour commitment, but many of them are not as in-depth as the PSA training. And if you're interested in learning more about the PSA produce food safety training, please reach out. I can share lots of details. I've offered many of these classes over the past 5 years or so. And we actually have several of these classes coming up early in the new year. But again, not the only option, but an excellent way to get that basic understanding of produce food safety. The second thing is to take a look at your farm and assess your on-farm risks. Now, if you've been through the PSA training, we spent a lot of time in that training talking about identifying risks and developing plans to address those risks. And this information can then be transferred to the realities of your farm. But again, very important that you understand what your particular issues are. There is a program in place called the On-Farm Readiness Review. The acronym for that is OFRR. And an on-farm readiness review is an invitation in Missouri, for example, to the regulatory agency for the produce safety rule, which is the Missouri Department of Agriculture, and their educational partner, which is University of Missouri Extension, to send a team to your farm. Again, this is done at your request. It's a chance to spend time with food safety specialists looking at the realities of your farm. I've done nearly 60 of these on-farm readiness reviews, and in most cases, these take about 2 to 3 hours. And I will mention that these are programs that don't take away records. We don't take away photographs. We don't take away anything that is identifiable to your farm. So, anything that we discuss, that we notice, is kept confidential. The goal of the on-farm readiness review is to help you understand risks that might be present on your farm and to help you understand how to take measures to address those risks. So if you're interested in an on-farm readiness review, please reach out, and I can certainly assist you in scheduling an on-farm readiness review to come to your farm and spend time with you working with risk identification. It's also possible to work individually with a specialist. There are a number of us here in Missouri that are trained in produce food safety issues. And we could certainly come on farm to work with you, or if you wanted to meet or even communicate by email or telephone, that option is certainly available as well. But basically, the goal of this particular aspect of preparation is to identify any weaknesses or any problems that might be present on your farm and to give you a chance to correct those problems, to develop procedures to address these problems and correct them before the auditor arrives and identifies those problems. So again, you want to be as prepared as you can be for when the auditor arrives. And an on-farm readiness review or some other aspect of risk identification is a great way to do that. The third thing that needs to be done is you need to develop a produce food safety plan. Almost all third-party audits require a produce food safety plan. Now, produce food safety plans are standardized. They have specific sections, and here are examples of those sections. There's information identifying the farm, its description, the crops or commodities that are grown, the size of the farm, the name and contact information for the farm food safety manager. In many cases, particularly small farms, that's the farmer. And then the bulk of the farm food safety plan is a risk assessment of practices and environmental conditions that might impact food safety. Okay. Once these risks are assessed, then the plan includes the practices that are in place to reduce these risks and the records that document the practices that are in place to address risks. Now, this sounds like a bit of a daunting task, and certainly it does require some time and effort to accomplish. But a good way to start is to work with a template. The slide here illustrates a template that's available from the Produce Safety Alliance. There are a number of other templates that are available to help get the process going. But recognize that the Produce Food Safety Plan needs to be your plan. It needs to be aligned with the realities of your farm. And so you really just can't take someone else's plan, put your name on it, and think you're ready. You have to go through the process, as I mentioned, to describe your farm, identify the risks on your farm, develop the practices to address those risks, and keep the records to document those practices. With University of Missouri Extension, we offer workshops in developing farm food safety plans, and we also offer individual consultation to help farmers in developing their food safety plans. I've spent a number of very interesting hours working with farmers to help review plans and help with the process of developing a farm food safety plan. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to bounce ideas or have someone take a look at a plan that you've developed. Again, the goal of this particular part is to identify weaknesses and address them before the auditor arrives. Now, as I mentioned, there are lots of templates available to help you with the process, but it really needs to reflect your realities. And it's not a wish list. It should reflect what you're actually doing. Now, obviously, if there are risks that need to be addressed and you haven't done that yet, then it does become a bit of a wish list. But make sure that you only include in there what you can actually do. And then obviously make sure that you live up to your plan, because the inspectors, the auditors will, they are trained in produce food safety, and they will certainly be able to tell if your food safety plan aligns with the realities of your farm. The next thing to do to prepare for an audit is to keep records. Keep in mind that a third-party audit, such as a GAP audit, is a reflection of a farm that is in operation, okay? And part of effective operation of a farm is to keep records of the activities on that farm. Now, from the standpoint of a third-party audit, or for that matter, from the standpoint of the produce safety rule, there are a number of required records. And the produce safety rule records, that's a great place to start from the standpoint of understanding which records you should be keeping. But as we'll see here in a moment, we're going to take a look at the GAP's audit checklist. And there are a number of records that are included on that checklist from the standpoint of the desk audit we mentioned earlier. And so it's very important that those records be in place when the auditor arrives. Now, what this means is that typically you're going to have your farm in operation for some period of time and gather and keep those records before you schedule the audit. If you're a brand new farm and you're interested in this audit, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation, because you have to have these records in place to demonstrate your good intent from the standpoint of the requirement of maintaining records. But if you don't have operations where you've gathered the records from, obviously you don't have the records. So typically with a GAPS audit, this is something that takes place after the farm has been in operation for a period of time. And this just makes sense too. You need time to identify risk, you need time to develop practices to address those risks, and you need time to develop the records to document those practices. Now, some basic, again, as I mentioned, there are a number of records that you'll be interested in keeping, but good ones would be things such as your water use assessment, the results of your water tests, your training records, cleaning records, and many others. Now, again, if you have any questions about what these records might look like, there are excellent templates available to help with keeping records. And please reach out if you'd like to discuss your particular farm and the records that you're interested in keeping. I'd be very happy to work with you on that aspect of produce food safety as well. And then the final thing is to understand the audit verification checklist. So I mentioned that an audit is a GAPS audit is a little bit like an exam, and your farm has to pass that exam. Well, it's actually an open book exam, because you can look at the audit verification checklist, the same checklist that the auditor is going to use, and you can go bullet by bullet through the checklist, think about the realities of your farm, and identify any problems before the auditor arrives with the same checklist. And you can address those issues so that you're ready for the audit. And the next part of our time together is going to be focused on looking at the audit verification checklist. So we're not going to go through the entire audit verification checklist. I think it's about a 17-page document, but we'll go through a couple of sections to give you a feel for what it looks like. And then if you're interested in going for that third-party GAPS audit, you can visit the link that I have here noted on the slide and take a look in depth at the checklist. So the checklist is based upon the Food and Drug Administration guidance document. And this was a document that was put out a number of years ago. And the FDA, when they developed the GAPS audit, they aligned the content of the audit with the content of the guidance document. And because the FDA was involved in this, again, as we've moved into a more regulated area with the produce safety rule, the points in a produce safety rule inspection are going to be very similar to the bullets in the checklist. In the case of a GAPS audit checklist, it's point-based, as I mentioned. We'll see what that looks like here in a moment, but each of the bullets has a point value assigned to it. There are a few exceptions. Most of them have a point value assigned to them. And if you pass during the inspection, you receive those points. But there may be some situations, there may be some areas that you don't pass, but as long as your overall audit is scored at 80% or better, you meet the USDA certification requirements. So a passing grade, a passing score is 80%. So the parts of the checklist, first of all, of course, there's some introductory material and questions, and then an idea of the audit scope. So let's take a quick look at these. So here are the introductory questions. First of all, the auditor is going to ask if the farm has participated in a GAP training. And as I mentioned, the Produce Safety Alliance 8-hour mandatory training is an excellent way to be able to answer yes to that particular bullet point. Secondly, is there a map that accurately represents the farm and the facility operations? Now, you'll notice that in these questions, in most of them, there's a yes or a no, but there's also a few questions that have a not applicable or an NA. And there may be some situations where the question just doesn't apply to your operation. For example, the third question here, does the company have more than one packing facility? Well, it may be that you don't have any packing facilities at all. Perhaps your crop is packed in the field and sent directly to market. In that case, it's going to be an NA. Is there a floor plan of the packing house facility indicating flow of product, storage areas, cull areas, break rooms, restrooms, offices, etc.? And then finally, is any product commingled prior to packing? So again, these will be the first questions that the auditor will ask, and this sets the stage for the remainder of the checklist. Now, the audit scope. So the GAPS audit has 5 different parts to it. Part 1 is the farm review, Part 2, field harvest and field packing activities, Part 3, house packing facility, Part 4, storage and transportation, Part 5, preventative food defense procedures. Now, all of these may not apply to your farm. So in other words, the scope of the audit may not include all of these parts. For example, perhaps the farm is a pick-your-own blueberry farm that doesn't have storage and transportation, that doesn't have a house packing facility. Well, those parts of the audit would not be included in the third-party audit. The audit would focus on Part 1 and Part 2. Many farms do not use Part 5, which is preventative food defense procedures. It's just not applicable to the way that they run their farms. So you'll obviously want to read through the entire checklist and understand the parts and understand which parts of the parts apply to your farm. So again, as I mentioned, Part 1, Part 2, and frequently Part 3 and 4 will apply to farms, but not all farms. And then there are farms, of course, where Part 5 will apply as well. Okay, so let's take a look now at what some of the specific bullets are in the verification checklist. And it starts off with general questions. And those general questions include questions related to the food safety program that is in place. They relate to traceability, and they relate to worker health and hygiene. So I've drawn the next several slides are drawn directly from the checklist, and let's take a look at what they look like. Okay, so here are the first 2 questions in the checklist. Question 1, a documented food safety program that incorporates GAP and/or GHP has been implemented. And question 2, the operation has designated someone to implement and oversee an established food safety program, and who is that person? Now, taking a look at the scoring part of these questions, notice that there are no points assigned to these 2 questions. These are questions that the answer has to be yes. And if the answer isn't yes, then the audit doesn't proceed. So in other words, you've got to have these 2 things in place before the auditor arrives. And notice that in the final column under documentation, there is a D. And a D is a document. And you have to have in hand a document. In this case, a document is a combination of a standard operating procedure and records that the auditor can take a look at. So again, these typically are going to be part of your produce food safety farm plan. So the first two questions. Now looking at the general questions, traceability, G1 and G2. G1, a documented traceability program has been established. Now notice in this case, this is not, you can't choose not applicable because from the standpoint of a third-party audit, the assumption is there that you're producing crop that is then being sold. And obviously, the traceability is an important aspect of understanding where that crop came from and where it goes. And so you have to answer either yes or no. There needs to be documentation in place. This particular question is worth 15 points. This is a pretty important one. The second, G2, the operation has performed a mock recall that was proven to be effective. Now, in this case, it could be a non-applicable yes or no. There needs to be a record if indeed the mock recall was performed. And again, a 10-point question there. Now, moving on with worker health and hygiene. So G3, drinking water is available to all workers, a 10-point question. This is one that you can't answer not applicable. So in other words, the assumption is that you are providing drinking water, or at least you probably should be. If you check no, then of course you're going to lose those points. Or if the auditor checks no, that you're going to lose those points. And documentation in that case is a record. G4, all employees and all visitors to the location are required to follow proper sanitation and hygiene practices. This is another one that you can't check not applicable. Okay. The assumption is that all farms are going to provide hand washing facilities and sanitation facilities where workers can relieve themselves or visitors can relieve themselves. And of course, there needs to be a policy in place from this standpoint. G5, training on proper sanitation hygiene practices is provided to all staff. Again, you can't check not applicable on this one. It's either a yes or a no, and there needs to be documentation. And in fact, all training that takes place on a farm should be documented. And then G6, employees and visitors are following good hygiene sanitation practices. Again, another question or another bullet where you cannot check not applicable. G7, employees who handle or package produce are washing their hands before beginning and returning to work. And again, all of these bullets have points associated with them. If the answer is or if yes is selected, then you achieve those points. If you end up with a no, you lose those points. If you have the option to check not applicable, then frequently the auditor is going to want an explanation of why that particular practice is a not applicable one. And if that's the case, then those points are neither pluses nor minuses. They're just not part of the final tally. Okay, continuing on with the general questions. Readily understandable signs. G9, all toilet, restroom, field sanitation facilities are clean and properly supplied and properly maintained. G10, again, more information on toilet, restroom, field sanitation facilities serviced and cleaned. And G11, smoking and eating are confined to designated areas separate from where product is handled. Now, as I mentioned before, a third-party audit typically starts with a desk audit, where the R's, the P's, and the S's the R's, the P's, and the D's are going to be examined. You know, the documents, the policies, and the records are going to be examined. And then the auditor is going to walk through the farm, walk through the pack house, and make sure that the operations that were discussed during the desk audit are actually in place. And they'll be using this checklist to score and to document what they see. Okay, so some more G's related to health. Workers who are ill, diarrheal diseases, or other infectious diseases are prohibited from handling fresh produce. Again, another bullet point where not applicable is not an answer. G13, procedures which specify handling disposition of produce or fruit contact surfaces that have come into contact with blood or other bodily fluids. Again, we need to have a policy in place for this. G14, workers are instructed to seek proper treatment with clean first aid supplies for cuts, abrasions, or other injuries. And again, that's a P. And G15, company personnel or contracted personnel that apply regulated pre-harvest or post-harvest materials are licensed. And this is particularly related to a pesticide use or to other chemicals that might be applied. And in this case, there needs to be a record related to that. Okay, so that takes care of the general questions. The second part of the GAP audit checklist is the farm review. And the farm review covers water use, sewage treatment, animals, wildlife, livestock, animal-based soil amendments and municipal biosolids, soils, and traceability. And we're just going to take a look at the first few bullets. This is a fairly long section, so we'll look at just the first few bullets in this particular part of the checklist. And for example, with a focus on water, what is the source of irrigation water? Where does the water come from? Is it from a well? Is it from a pond or a stream? Is it municipal water? And then what are the irrigation techniques that are used on the farm? Is the farm using sprinklers, or is it using drip irrigation or flood irrigation? All of these have impacts from the standpoint of produce food safety and risk. And then looking at the first several questions on the actual score sheet, 1-3, a water quality assessment has been performed to determine the quality of water used for irrigation purposes on the crops being applied. Now, what is a water quality assessment? That's a good question. And this is one area that is discussed in depth in the Produce Safety Alliance training. And of course, there are other resources out there as well to understand what a water quality assessment should look like. This requires a document. Question number 4, water quality assessment is performed to determine the quality of water used for chemical application or fertigation. So again, more discussion on how the quality of water used for a farming practice is determined. Question 5, if necessary, steps are taken to protect irrigation water from potential direct or non-point source contamination. Now, this might be an example of a question that you could legitimately answer as not applicable. For example, if a farm was using municipal water, well, in that case, the water arrives in potable condition to the farm, and as long as there's no breaks in water distribution systems, then the possibility or the need to take these steps is not applicable to that particular farm. So again, looking at the checklist and looking at each question and figuring out if that applies to your realities is an important part of preparing for the third-party audit. A couple of questions related to sewage treatment. A farm sewage treatment system or a septic system is functioning properly. There's no evidence of leaking or runoff. That's pretty straightforward. And then the 7th question, there's no municipal sewage or commercial sewage treatment facility or waste material landfill adjacent to the farm. That's pretty straightforward as well. And then some questions related to animals, wildlife, and livestock. Question number 8, crop production areas are not located near or adjacent to dairy, livestock, or fowl production facilities unless adequate barriers exist. And so in this case, you really can't answer not applicable. It's either yes or no. And some questions related to manure handling, where are the manure lagoons located? Question 10, manure stored near or adjacent to crop production areas is contained. Question 11, measures are taken to restrict access of livestock to the source or delivery system of crop irrigation water. Question 12, crop production areas are monitored for the presence or signs of wild or domestic animals then entering the land. And question 13, measures are taken to reduce the opportunity for wildlife or domestic animals from entering crop production areas. And again, some of these could honestly be answered as not applicable. For example, if there's no livestock on the farm or in areas adjacent to the farm, then many of these bullets are not applicable to that particular farm. Okay, so the remainder of the checklist, I'm not going to go into detail looking at individual bullets. We've seen what those bullets look like in the first 2 sections, and it'll be a similar structure. Very important when preparing for the audit to go through bullet by bullet all of these sections and think about how each bullet point applies to the reality of a particular farm. Okay, the next section is related to field harvest and field packing activities. And this is focused on field sanitation and hygiene and field harvesting and transportation. The next section is on house packing facilities, and there'll be bullet points related to receiving, washing and packing lines, packing house worker health and hygiene, packing house general housekeeping, pest control, and traceability. The next section is focused on storage and transportation. There'll be bullets related to product, containers, and pallets, pest control, ice and refrigeration, transportation, worker health and personal hygiene, and traceability. And the final section of the audit checklist is related to preventative food defense procedures. And so there's bullets related to secure employee visitor procedures and secure facility procedures. Okay, so that is a look at the checklist. And as I mentioned several times, and I'll mention again, very important for a person considering the GAPS audit to spend some time with the checklist and go bullet by bullet, section by section, and deciding how these bullets relate to the realities of a particular farm. Okay, so again, just to review what happens during an audit. First of all, the audit is scheduled. Then hopefully preparations are in place for the audit. The auditor arrives and the audit process takes place. The results of the audit are scored using the checklist. The farmer or the food business pays for the audit. The auditor then reports back to the farmer with the eventual results. If needed, a follow-up audit is scheduled to address any areas of concern. Typically, an unannounced follow-up visit takes place at some time point following the issuance of the audit certificate. Again, just a follow-up visit to make sure that good practices are still in place. And with most third-party audits, this is an annual process. The audit must be repeated each year. And again, just some more thoughts on the unannounced follow-up visit. Typically, what happens is that the auditor will want to come back at some point fairly soon after the audit, but in an unannounced situation, again, just to document that the findings of the scheduled audit, the planned audit, line up with what is seen during the unannounced follow-up visit. The unannounced follow-up visit will take place while operations are happening at the farm. And that's a point that I should have made earlier, but I will make now. Third-party audits are always scheduled when things are happening on the farm. You know, when crops are being grown, crops are being harvested, and crops are being handled in pack houses. There's really a third-party audit that is scheduled during a time when operations are not taking place is not effective. You know, if we're going to, if an auditor is going to understand food safety practices, they have to see operations in place, and that applies to the unannounced follow-up visit as well. In Missouri, good agricultural practices or GAPS audits are managed by the Missouri Department of Agriculture. And it's a very straightforward process to schedule a third-party audit through GAPS in Missouri. Reach out to the Missouri Department of Agriculture, and the website that is the portal for that program is, again, agriculture.mo.gov, grains, and then specialty crop audits. Very easy to find this with a Google search as well. Now, how much is a GAPS audit going to cost? Well, the USDA sets the per hour charge for a third-party GAPS audit. And the charge was most recently adjusted in October of 2022. And it's currently $132 per hour. Now, this applies, first of all, to the preparatory work and coordination on the part of the auditor, the time that's actually spent on the audit on farm, the paperwork and audit completion after the farm visit, processing of corrective actions if applicable, a round trip travel time charge, in other words, the time from when the auditor leaves their office to arrive at the farm and then from the farm back to the office. In Missouri, our auditors typically are traveling from Jefferson City, so that gives you an idea of the start and end point of the round trip. And then the USDA also reviews all GAPS audits, and they have a charge associated with their administrative services and their review as well. So a reasonable estimate for an initial GAPS audit is going to be somewhere between $1,300 to $1,600 plus the travel time that I mentioned earlier. Now, if there has to be a follow-up audit, of course, there'll be additional charges for that. And there's also a charge for the unannounced review. So again, these are, an audit is not an inexpensive process. And as I mentioned before, very important to be prepared for that audit so that particularly the time spent on farm in the course of the audit is that time is spent very efficiently. So be prepared so that you don't have to take extra time during the course of the actual audit. Now, with the substantial costs associated with the GAPS audit, the question might be, well, is there any financial assistance to help with these costs? And the answer at the moment is, indeed, there is. University of Missouri Extension has a cost share program in place that will cover half of the cost of the audit, up to $800. Now, this is a reimbursement, although it can be arranged in advance, or it can be arranged as a direct payment to the Missouri Department of Agriculture if necessary. But it will cover half of the cost of the audit, up to $800. This program is in place until August 30th of 2024. And for more information on that, certainly visit this website or reach out, and I'm happy to share details on that program. We are also at the very tail end of a USDA program called the Food Safety Certification by Specialty Crops program. And this is a pandemic era program that is ending in 2023. But if a farm has undergone a produce food safety auction, a GAPS, a third-party auction in 2023, it is possible to get a partial or even complete reimbursement of the expenses associated with that audit. And so there's information at the website that's noted here. But as I mentioned, this program is ending in 2023. So if you're interested in applying for this program, you want to do it without delay. Okay, now some brief comments on other USDA third-party audits. And first, the Harmonized Food Safety Standard. This is a program that was put in place to using the GAPS audit as a starting point, but an effort to harmonize the GAPS audit with other audit tools, other third-party audit tools that are available. It is not a point-based scoring system. The questions that are on the GAPS Harmonized Food Safety Score Sheet are answered in either compliant, corrective actions needed, immediate action required, or not applicable. And so again, it's not a point-based thing. It's a yes, no, or serious or not applicable. There are three main sections to the Harmonized Food Safety Audit. These are the general questions, similar to what we saw before, field operations and harvesting, and post-harvest operations. And then there are additional sections in the Harmonized Food Safety Standard related to tomatoes and tomato production. And again, obviously, if you're not growing tomatoes, then these sections would be not applicable, but they include open house production and harvesting of tomatoes, packing house management of tomatoes, greenhouse production of tomatoes, and packing and distribution of tomatoes. And again, just to give you a question about the acceptance criteria for a harmonized GAP audit. First of all, you can't have any questions that are assessed as immediate action required. Obviously, that is a serious issue. If there's any falsification of records, this is considered an immediate action required. If there are any questions marked in the or any questions that are marked in the score sheet as mandatory, they must be assessed as compliant. Operations must have performed all risk assessments that are designated with an A in the documentation column. If the auditee has been audited against the USDA GAP standard or the produce GAP's harmonized food safety standard previously, the auditee must have addressed all immediate actions required or other issues following their established corrective action procedure. And at least 80% of the questions that are in the major sections, G, F, and P of the audit, at least 80% of the questions not answered as not applicable must be answered as compliant. So in other words, of the bullets, at least 80% of the bullets must be answered as compliant. Then we have two other USDA third-party audits, the Harmonized GAP Plus, which is basically some slight modifications of the harmonized food safety audit to bring the harmonized audit into even greater compliance with international standards. And then the group GAP audit program allows groups of farmers, the members of a food hub or the members of a marketing organization to work together to schedule audits, in tandem so that they save money, they pool resources, and they achieve a group GAP audit certification. Now, a group GAP audit certification is only as strong as the weakest link among the farmers. So obviously, even if a farm is seeking a group GAP audit membership as part of a group, they have to be individually prepared because all of the farms within the group will be visited. Again, it's just an effort to make the third-party audit more affordable for groups of farmers. The criteria used in group GAP audits are very similar to the criteria used for a standard GAPS audit that a single farm would apply for. Now, the final thing we're going to talk about tonight is a third-party audit in your future? And the answer may be yes, the answer may be no. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, a third-party audit is a voluntary decision on the part of a farmer. But it is important to have this discussion with customers, with markets, to understand, first of all, if they require a third-party audit, and secondly, if they do, which third-party audit are they interested in? And so this is a question to ask up front. Now, as you probably heard me say several times in the course of going through each of those individual bullets, it's not a requirement that you be audited for each part of the audit checklist. You as a farmer are going to determine which parts fit your operation the best. Now, yes, there are some mandatory questions on all of the audits. All farms have to address those, but there are a number of situations where entire sections of an audit may not be applicable to a particular farm. And it's frequently the case where, as you go bullet by bullet, that there are bullets within each section that don't apply. So you figure out which parts fit your operation the best. And obviously, before moving ahead with the third-party audit, it's important to have a conversation with the market that is expecting this third-party audit to make sure that those sections or bullets that are not applicable to your farm are, the overall approach is still going to comply with their request for that third-party food safety audit. Don't be surprised if there may be more than one audit that you have to submit to if you're trying to supply multiple retailers, multiple food service suppliers, or again, diverse markets. There may be more than one situation. There may be more than one audit requirements that you have to deal with. Keep in mind, too, that if your farm is subject to the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule, you will have to submit to an inspection from the standpoint of the Produce Safety Rule, as well as any third-party audits that you may have to arrange for as well. But keep in mind that all of these things, the Produce Safety Rule inspection and the majority of auditing firms, third-party auditing firms, are looking at the same basic principles of produce food safety. And those principles, as I mentioned, are discussed in detail in the PSA food safety training. And you probably have gathered from my numerous references to the Produce Safety Alliance training that this is a really good exposure to produce safety as it relates to all aspects of farming. So a good place to start from the standpoint of understanding safe production, handling, and transportation of produce. Okay, and then finally, we'll talk briefly about some resources. The University of Missouri Extension has a produce food safety website, and this website includes information on upcoming Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Alliance trainings, information on scheduling on-farm readiness reviews. There's produce food safety resources on that website and discussion about the cost share for the third-party audits that I mentioned earlier. Kansas State University has a similar extensive produce food safety website that I encourage everyone to visit as well. The Produce Safety Alliance has many resources, particularly focused on helping farmers prepare for GAPS audits. some excellent templates, for example, on farm food safety plans. The USDA Ag Marketing Service website has in-depth information specific to the third-party audits developed by the USDA, including the GAPS audit. USDA Farm Services Agency has discussion about that third-party audit cost share that I mentioned, which ends at the end of this year. The National Association of State Departments of Agriculture has a very nice overview of GAPS audits and other third-party audits on their website. And the Missouri Department of Agriculture, as I mentioned, the agency that conducts GAPS audits in Missouri, visit their website to learn more about GAPS audits. And when you're at the point of scheduling audit, this is where you'll go as well. So that's an introduction to preparation for GAPS audits. We covered a lot of material. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to get into this material individually, I'd be happy to visit with you. Here is my contact information. I'll mention too that we have Produce Safety Alliance trainings coming up in February, and we would welcome you to joining those classes. On-farm readiness reviews are easy to schedule. Be happy to help with that as well. And again, just to be a good general resource for anyone who's interested in produce food safety, please reach out and share your interest. So with that, let me go ahead and stop sharing.
And I'd also like to add real quick, Patrick has helped a couple of our sites at SCG become certified in GAP. And I know that a lot of our farmers who are new to farming and new to the process, definitely new to these sort of certifications, we're pretty intimidated by the requirements at first. And now we have a couple sites who have the certifications, and for them, I know it's a lot of record keeping, but it's not as scary as they originally thought it would be. And, if we can do it with a team of beginning farmers, then definitely anyone listening can do it as well. And there are so many resources out there for people. If you are interested, as Patrick mentioned, a lot of the time, if you're trying to break into a market that is an institution, they will require this level of certification just because they have to ensure that the produce they're sourcing is coming from reliable hands and it's not going to be contaminated in any way. So I'd like to reiterate that Patrick is a resource. The extension office near you, I know, will have resources. And if you're in the Ozarks and want to talk to some farmers who have gone through this recently, we're always happy to let people tour our sites and talk more with you. So I just really encourage you to reach out if this is something that you're interested in pursuing.
And I will say, as Anna mentioned, I've worked with a number of farmers that have achieved GAPS audit status. And, it can be a bit of a daunting process at the very beginning, but those points that I showed as far as getting ready for the audit, take them point by point. And what appears initially as a daunting process becomes a very manageable process. But please feel free to reach out. If Extension in general or myself in particular can be of assistance as you work through the process, let us know. Be happy to help with that.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you, Patrick. We really appreciate it. And I know we'll be able to offer some more in-person and Zoom workshops soon. So thank you again for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, please feel free to reach out at any point if you'd like to move further down on the idea of becoming GAP certified.